So in 2007, I was working as a reporter at KUOW Public Radio, 94.9 FM Seattle. And I had offered to be the fill-in DJ for our swing music show, the Swing Years and Beyond, on Saturday nights. And I really mostly knew about the show as a fan. That's the most I knew about that era of music from the 1920s through the 1950s. And our regular DJ, Amanda Wild, very kindly and gamely offered to take me on and train me and show me everything that we had in our music library to help me get ready to DJ her show on a semi-regular fill-in basis. And so she brought me down to our music library, and there's just a wall of CDs. And she was showing me how everything was organized. And she said, you know, female band leaders never really get their due, so why don't you make sure to play one? Like this. And she pulled a CD off the shelf. And it was Ina Ray Hutton and her orchestra. Ina Ray Hutton, known as the blonde bombshell band leader of the 1930s and part of the 40s. And first we looked at the back of the CD, which is what we were doing with all the stuff she was pulling off the shelf, just to see the track listings, what was there. She was pointing out what I might want to play in her show. And there was one of those classic blonde bombshell pictures of Ina Ray Hutton on the back, kind of posed with that glamour shot you see from the 30s and 40s a lot, where they're like, you know, like that. And she had just that platinum blonde hair that is hard enough to get today, that hair color. But in the 30s, you can't imagine what she had to go through to get that hair. And so on the front, we looked at it just to see the title, and so I'd be able to recognize it easily if I pull it off the shelf. And it was a very different picture. It was Ina Ray Hutton in her band leader pose, and the band behind her, it wasn't women, which typically she was known for leading a band of all-girl band, as they called it back then. It was all men, seated in a very formal setting. And she was still wearing a fancy gown, but it was much more modest. And she had her baton, and she was looking straight at the camera, very serious, and with a little bit of a smirk. And she had brown hair. It was very different. It was this brief phase of her career where she was trying to be taken more seriously as a musician. And so she had gone brunette, because everyone knows brunettes are very serious. And so she had her hair done up, but it was a much more kind of modest hairdo, kind of up like this. And there was something about her hair being brown and just the way that it being up like that set off the rest of her face. And the way Amanda and I both remember it is I said something like, I think that chick may be black. And you might say, well, why did she jump to that conclusion? Well, her hair being up like that, it really made her forehead stand out. She had this big forehead like this. And she had these big round cheeks like this. And she had nice round lips like this. And I looked at her, and it was like I was seeing a 1930s version of myself, who could lead a band and was skinny and could dance. But this part, I was like, I know that, I recognize that. I've known my whole life that I'm black and I'm white, and that other people haven't always recognized that. And so I just thought there might be something to it. So I was able to look at some census records from 1920 and 1930 when she was a child, and looked her up under her birth name, which was known. It was known during her career and during her lifetime that her real name was Odessa Cowan. And so I looked up little Odessa Cowan from 1920 and 1930 Chicago census, and there she was with her mom and her grandma and her step-grandfather living on the south side of Chicago as black people. The census taker called them, it just depended what year they were doing the census, what terminology they used. They would either use mulatto, black, or Negro, just depending on what year it was. So across these decades, the census taker definitely was marking them as black. And for me, at that point, I knew I was onto something. But I know that for some people, that wouldn't exactly explain the whole thing. Oh, maybe there was some kind of mistake every 10 years. how could this person be black? She doesn't look black. So I did as much research as I could, and the next step in that was to look at the archives of the Chicago Defender, which is the black newspaper in Chicago, still published today. And thankfully, their archives are indexed and have been OCR scanned and all this great stuff. So I just had to go to the UW library and type in her birth name, and I started getting results. I got a picture of her from when she was about 7 years old, and she was in her tap class. She took tap under a prominent black dance teacher in Chicago, and she was kind of doing the little girl version of that pose, one of those glamour poses like this, in like a 20s, flapper costume for a little kid with a big fancy hat and everything. And she was in that class with 2 other black girls. And it was in the black newspaper as a community event. She and her sister, June Cowan, were also listed as having performed and danced in fashion shows for the community, things like that. I started looking up her mother, her grandmother, her step-grandfather. They were all over the black newspaper. Her mom played piano in a dance hall in a black hotel. Her grandmother was always written up in the social columns as far as who she was having over to dinner and what fundraisers she was involved in and where she had visited their cousins in Michigan. And even her step-grandfather, he wrote an article for the black newspaper. It was great. It was about how the Homestead Act was going to apply to black people for the first time. So what I got from all this was that these weren't just people that the census taker was calling black. These were people who were active in the black community on the south side of Chicago during a very segregated time. Something else I could see through the census records was that their neighborhood was becoming less mixed and more of a black neighborhood, as it's often still referred to today. So they were very involved in all these things that were written up in the newspaper until Odessa was 8, and abruptly there were no more mentions of her or her family in the Chicago Defender, despite the fact that they had the same address and continued to live there well into Ina's teenage years, or Odessa's teenage years. And so that's part of what happened around this time. Odessa became Ina. What we know about Ina Ray Hutton's official story is that when she was 8, at that same time that she was no longer being written about in the Chicago Defender, she was discovered by a white vaudeville producer, and she started to perform on Broadway in New York. And she started to get billing by the time she was about 14 as Ina Ray. And she joined the Ziegfeld Follies when she was about 16. And when she was about 18, a new manager put together a band and plucked her from Ziegfeld Follies and put Hutton on the end of her name, and she became Ina Ray Hutton, the blonde bombshell band leader. And he gave her strappy sequin gowns, and she did costume changes at her shows, and she became legendary for being so amazing, such a hot performer that guys would mob her, and she needed her own security team when she would perform at a USO base. So what else do we know about Ina at this time of her life? Well, part of what made her stand out as a performer was that she danced in this incredible way that nobody else was dancing at that time, at least nobody who had the white stage. Today, she's compared by music historians to Madonna in the way that she dressed and danced. And that was part of what critics would write about her at the time, was just her dancing was just off the charts. How was she doing it? And they would write about her in these kind of what I guess we might consider today kind of PG-13 terms, but at the time it was pretty racy how some of these critics would write about her and just kind of verbally drool over her on the page. So Ina kept doing her thing. She had her brief brunette phase, but then she went back to being blonde, and she really was involved in band leading all the way up through the 1960s, and she retired. She had a television gig, and then she retired probably in the late 60s when really her style of music wasn't really the thing anymore. She married 4 times. She had 4 husbands, and her sister married once and had a much more long, sustained marriage. Ina didn't have any children that we know of. Her sister June had 2 children, and they both died. June died in the 70s, and Ina died in 1984. And they took with them to their graves the fact that they were both black. And how do we know that? Well, they didn't tell June's children that they were black. I did. So that's another story. But something that came out of that was that not only did it answer some of their questions about who their mother was and who their aunt was, some things that just had never quite made sense before started to kind of come together the more it sunk in about why someone's hair looked like this, or why someone's nose looked like that, and how the explanation they gave for it didn't quite make sense. And even people in their generation and beyond had gotten comments in their lives of just, about their hair or the shapes of their bodies that, you kind of look black, and these things started to make sense to them over time. But then there was also the mystery of, well, why did they never tell us? Why would they have chosen to not do that? And to examine that, you look into the history of passing a little bit. It's known as passing for white. When you're black and in the Jim Crow era and you are light enough to have people mistake you for white and you let them do that, it's known as passing for white. And when people started to have their children pass for white when they were still children, they were giving them messages about, this is something that we're having you do not only for opportunity that you could get to be on a stage you wouldn't otherwise be on, but also for your freedom and even your safety. People were getting really heavy messages about, this is something we're doing for you. You have to keep doing this. Never talk about this. Always say your name is that. Make sure your hair looks like this. Make sure you don't say that. And when you start to examine that, you start to understand why they might have thought it was the best thing to just never pass this along to their children verbally during their lifetimes. So, what does this tell us about leadership, unconventional leadership? Well, we have a lot of leaders in this story, and I'll just talk about 2 of them. One is Amanda Wild, our swing music DJ, who took me on, someone who knew almost nothing about swing music other than that I enjoyed listening to it. And she trained me so that I could fill in for her, and she communicated to me what was important to her. Female band leaders never really get their due. Make sure you play one in every hour if you can. And without her having done that and taken the time, and without her response to my curiosity, I wouldn't be standing here telling you about this story. And it might have been who knows how many more decades before Ina's family got to learn more about who they are. And the other unconventional leader, of course, in this story is Ina, Odessa. It can be really rewarding to be born ahead of your time, and it can make you a superstar. You could be compared to someone like Madonna decades later, but it can also be really painful. You'll be giving up things if you're in that circumstance. You might feel that you're forced to give things up, connection to family, friends, and who you really are, your true identity. And part of our narrative in American history is, oh, things were so bad then, it's good they're so much better now. But our obligation as leaders is to recognize what's still wrong now and decide, how are we going to address that? What are we going to do about that? How will my actions be viewed decades from now when people finally understand that this was wrong? So that's what Ina's story says to me, is how am I going to persevere? What choices am I going to make so that it will be clear decades from now that this was absurd, that this was wrong, but I did it anyway, and here I am dancing and you can't stop me now? Those are all things I get from Ina and her story, and they're things that I hope you think about when you go home later and look her up on YouTube, because she could get it. Ina Ray Hutton. Thanks.